This is the Thursday, November 18th, 2010 meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. Would you call the roll, please?
Joanna Croft.
Here.
Timothy Bigg.
Here.
Dean Cars.
Here.
Kenneth Burkhart.
Here.
Jeff Ron.
Here.
Joshua Fink.
Present.
Ann Denny.
Here.
Kate Williams.
Here.
Moving on our agenda, that brings us to the minutes. We have no minutes for approval. Next item on the agenda, special order of business, disclosures. Do we have any disclosures this evening? There are no disclosures from the board members. That moves us on to our consent agenda. We have two resolutions for approval this evening. Resolution number 2010-032 and resolution 2010-033. We have also a request that's been handed out to all the board members for postponement of approval of resolution 2010-033. Have all the board members had a chance to read that request? If so, I'd entertain a motion to, we need to act to approve the consent agenda or pull an item from the consent agenda. So I'd entertain a motion from a board member for one of those two actions. Am I missing something? Mr. Burkhart.
I move we pull resolution 2010-033 from the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart.
From the consent agenda.
From the consent agenda. Ms. Croft, you've indicated you.
Yes.
The second.
And that.
Second. Very well. Is there any objection to pulling that from the consent agenda? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quick clarification. When does the period begin for appeal? Is it upon decision of the board at our last meeting or mailing of the approved resolution?
30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision. So the mailing of the resolution.
Thank you.
Sure. Are there any other questions or comments? Any objection to pulling that item? Seeing none, that item has been pulled. So on the consent agenda, we have one item, resolution 2010-032. Is there any objection to, or any comments? I'm sorry. Thank you. Could I have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Mr. Vig, you've indicated.
That's correct.
Thank you. Ms. Croft, you've indicated a second. It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. Are there any objections? Seeing none, the consent agenda has been approved. We now have before us resolution number 2010-033. Mr. Burkhart, you indicated you'd pulled that.
Yes, I'd like to enter a motion to postpone consideration of that resolution to the next meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Ms. Croft, you had indicated seconding pulling it from the agenda.
Yes, I do. I second that.
You second that motion as well. Thank you. Any discussion?
Mr.
Burkhart?
Per the request we had from some attorneys that are representing the petitioners in that case, I don't see any downside to delaying the mailing of the written decision and our resolution here. Usually we find that if a petitioner has at least one of their variances granted, that they're usually in a hurry to get those resolutions mailed out, but I don't particularly see any downside here, and as long as they've made the request, I'm of a mind to vote in favor of postponing that.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Ms. Croft, do you have any comments?
Nothing further to add.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Mr. Vig?
I'm interested to hear any other opinions about what this means in terms of other requests for postponement or delay for petitioners who have their requests denied, if we're creating a problem for ourselves in the future. And I've not seen anything like this come up on the board before, but I'm curious from either staff or another board member if this is something they've seen.
This is the first time I recall it as well. However, I think the board has heard the case and acted on the case, and we've we've made our ruling. Mr. Barrett, is this this is not the norm? Has this occurred in the past, to your knowledge?
Mr. Chairman, it's not common, that's correct, but it has happened, especially on denials. The applicants have asked for a little time to regroup and try and figure out their options so that the 30-day clock isn't ticking right away.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Burkhart.
If this delays the mailing of the written decision, it stops, or the clock doesn't start for them appealing to Superior Court. So it isn't that postponing this will bring this action back before this board. It just suspends the clock, I guess, temporarily in terms of the appeal period to Superior Court.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig?
I just wonder if the appropriate place to request that extension is at the court rather than our board.
Mr. Fink?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I don't see any prejudice to the public. You know, the 30-day fuse on the appeal is pretty short. This law firm just got involved. Requesting a continuance doesn't seem unreasonable. Again, there's no harm to the public, at least that I've heard about, so I don't see no harm, no foul. They want more time to put their case together, and so I plan on supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Are there any other comments for any board members? If not, please, could we have a... Are you ready to vote? Oh, okay. Please vote on the motion to postpone action on Resolution 2010-033. That motion passes by a vote of 7-1. That moves us on along on our agenda. There are no appearance requests. There's no unfinished business. There are no items on the regular agenda, and that brings us to our public hearings. Before we hear our first case, I would like to read the order of business for variance hearings. The chair shall introduce the variance and explain the procedure to be followed. The variance case number and the name of the applicant shall be read into the record. The board shall hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board shall hear a brief staff presentation outlining the variance, not to exceed 10 minutes. On conclusion of the staff presentation, the board members and the applicant may then direct questions to the staff through the chair. The applicant shall give his/her presentation. not to exceed 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests upon the applicant, who must convince the board by a preponderance of the evidence that the variance should be granted. On conclusion of the applicant's presentation, the board members and the staff may then direct questions to the applicant through the chair. The hearing shall then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. All persons who testify may be questioned by the board, staff, or the applicant. On conclusion of the public testimony, the staff, followed by the applicant, shall have the right of rebuttal, 3 minutes each. The board shall proceed to develop oral findings and conclusions with regard to the variance and disposition of the variance. The staff shall reduce the oral findings and conclusions to writing for subsequent adoption by the board at a later meeting. The matter then rests with the board, and the chair asks for a positive motion from the board. That brings us to our first case this evening. The case number is 2010-131, the petitioner Phoenix 4-H LLC. Is the petitioner or the petitioner's representative here this evening? Thank you. And staff, could we have be provided with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This case was advertised on the municipal website. Additionally, 74 public hearing notices were sent on October 22nd. To date, 2 have been returned in support of the variances, of which 1 was received late and is marked agenda item number H1 in front of you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Would you proceed with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This case is a request for variances from Anchorage Municipal Code 2145-110 to allow an existing 6-foot fence in the front yard setback adjacent to West 27th Avenue. From Anchorage Municipal Code 2145-125 to allow a reduction in buffer landscaping width along the east lot line of Lot 3, middle 50 feet, and from 2145-080 to reduce the minimum parking stall length of 2 spaces from 20 feet to 17 feet and reduce the minimum 2-way drive aisle from 24 feet to 23 feet. These properties are legally described as Sunbeam Subdivision, Block 3, Lot 16 west 100 feet, Sunbeam Subdivision, Block 3, Lot 3 west 50 feet, and Sunbeam Subdivision, Block 3, Lot 3 middle 50 feet. They are generally located just north of Northern Lights Boulevard, west of Arctic Boulevard, and south of West 27th Avenue. Lot 16 is zoned B3, while lots 3 west 50 feet and middle 50 feet are zoned R4. All 3 lots are under common ownership. They are level and typical in size and shape to others in the area. All 3 lots appear to be legally non-conforming lots of record. However, only lots 3 west 50 feet and middle 50 feet have been registered and recorded. Anchorage Municipal Code 2115-010B requires that 7 standards be substantially met for a variance to be granted. I would like to address each standard individually. Standard number 1, staff finds that this standard is not substantially met. There are no unusual features which directly relate to the need for this variance. The lots are rectangular and similar in size and shape to other lots in the neighborhood. Standard number 2, staff finds that this standard is not substantially met. Because there are no unusual features of this property, planning cannot find that this standard is met. Standard number 3, staff finds that this standard is to be partially met. These lots are physically similar in shape and in size and shape to other lots in the neighborhood. There is nothing unique to distinguish these lots from others in the area which relates to the need for particular variances. However, the need for the variances is not the result of the actions of the petitioner. The site design existed at the time the petitioner purchased the property in 2005. The fence, landscaping, and parking are not self-imposed hardships or inconveniences created by the petitioner. Additionally, meeting the requirements for buffer landscaping would require redesigning the site. Standard number 4, staff finds this standard to be substantially met. The existing 6-foot fence, reduced buffer landscaping, and parking do not appear to have an adverse effect on adjacent properties, nor does it appear to be injurious to the neighborhood or public welfare. Use of adjacent properties permitted by code does not appear to be affected by the existing conditions. Standard number 5, staff finds this standard to be substantially met. The requested variances are for dimensional encroachment, dimensional variances, and are not use variances. Granting the variances will not change the character of the district. Standard number 6, staff finds this standard to be substantially met. Granting this variance will not adversely affect the health, safety, or welfare of the public. Standard number 7, staff finds this standard to be partially met. The fence could be relocated to within the district requirements while not impacting the parking area. Requiring buffer landscaping in accordance with Title 21 would impact the parking lots and turning maneuvering, causing a safety concern. As the 7 standards required under Anchorage Municipal Code 2115-010B have not been substantially met, the department must recommend denial for variances 1, 2, and 3. If after the public hearing the board establishes that each of the standards is met, the department recommends the approval be subject to the conditions on pages 10 and 11 of your staff packet, with one correction. I would like to remove condition number 4. That condition will be addressed at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Are there any questions of staff by the board members? Mr. Vig.
Thank you. Mr. Whitfield, with regard to standard number 3, without judging whether I feel the standard is met or not at this point, but typically the actions of prior owners have not been, I guess, carried forward or relieved the purchaser of the hurdle to overcome on that standard, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on why that your finding is that when the petitioner purchased the property, that the prior owner was the one that was responsible and not the purchaser.
May I have a second to consult with my coworker here?
Sure, thanks.
This particular property has had a somewhat long history. The previous owner had initiated a conditional use permit with the planning department to address the parking lots that are located on lots 3 west 50 feet and lots 3 middle 50 feet. That particular conditional use permit was actually never completed. So when the petitioner purchased the property in 2005, I would assume that he was under the assumption that the lot was legal, that the site was legal, and thus the department feels that you're absolutely right that when you purchase a property, it becomes your problem and you assume responsibility for violations. However, the department feels that the previous property owner had initiated, and to what I find, the new owner was under the assumption that the conditional use permit was completed. However, it wasn't, so that's why we supported that particular standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the chair, Mr. Whitfield, I noticed that traffic had 2 comments on this case, the second of which is pertaining to ADA compliance or non-compliance. Can staff speak to that and as to whether or not the board's acting on this variance request may have any impact on compliance or non-compliance with the ADA requirements for the lots?
You're absolutely right. The property does not comply with ADA requirements, and that was one of the comments that traffic had. The second comment was that the reduction in parking stall length and reduction in the width of the drive aisle be approved, however, that there be signage that indicates staff parking only. So, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Ms. Croft.
Mr. Whitfield, a question in terms of the buffer landscaping on both of the lot 3s. Do we know if the landscaping conformed to all the regulations in place at the time it was installed and the time it was built? And if so, then is it this restarting of the conditional use process that is triggering the review of the existing landscaping?
Through the chair, I cannot confirm that the landscaping at the time it was installed complied with the requirements of Municipal Code Title 21. A non-conforming determination would be required to address that. The conditional use permit has already been initiated. The reason why we're here tonight is because that particular conditional use permit was actually postponed and is waiting to hear the results of this particular hearing tonight.
So then it is because the conditional use, though, that this has to meet current Title 21 requirements? Is that what I'm...
No, ma'am. The conditional use permit, the action is waiting on the results of this particular hearing tonight to... Yes, it is. Being here tonight and getting variances for these 3 standards is a requirement of the conditional use permit in place right now. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. And then I had a question about where, if you can look at this survey there, we have a 4-foot conforming fence on 27th, and then we have a 6-foot fence. And I'm trying to understand where the 6-foot fence is, and the petitioner addressed it in the application, but I'm still not exactly sure where these fences are.
Yes, ma'am. Through the chair, the 2 fences are located at the north end of lots west 50 feet and middle 50 feet. The 6-foot fence is just to the north of the 4-foot fence along West 27th Avenue, within the 10-foot front yard setback.
I believe there's 2 small squares that
So are the 2 small squares indicating the end of the guardrail that this fence is sitting on top of, or are the 2 red dots? When I look at the color version that was in the petitioner's packet, are the 2 red dots the beginning and ending of this fence?
I apologize. I don't have a color version in front of me, so I can't speak to.
Perhaps that's a question we could ask the petitioner when they come forward.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Williams.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Whitfield, I was wondering if the 2 parking spots were simply removed, would that create any other problems in complying with the code?
Unfortunately, I haven't done a parking analysis on this particular property to find out if they have excess parking. If in fact they do, and this will not create a parking shortage, then it would not be an issue, no.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Burkhart.
I guess to follow up on the previous question, I've done a quick parking analysis here, and I'm wondering if any of these variances are necessary. That if this is a single-story building of 5,400 square feet, if it's ordinary retail at one space for 300 square feet, that would require 18 parking spaces. If it's a clinic and it's a medical, and you'd calculate that at one space for every 250 square feet, that the minimum required parking would be 22 spaces. So I think there's actually quite a few extra parking spaces here, such that if we remove those 2 spaces, we decrease the 42.2-foot length between the parking spaces on the northern lots, and increase that to 10-foot buffer landscaping, and just move the fence back to the point at which a 6-foot chain link fence would be allowed. We wouldn't need any of these variances.
That is correct, sir.
Okay.
Very good analysis.
Well, we'll ask the petitioner if he needs to go forward with this or not.
Are there any other questions by staff from any of the board members? Seeing none, could the petitioner come forward, please? And could you state and spell your name for the record?
Mr. Chairman, my name is Pete Diemer, D-I-E-M-E-R, and it is my pleasure to represent the petitioner, Phoenix 4-H, in this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Deemer. You have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think rather than move through all of these standards, I think the staff did a fairly good job in the synopsis, other than our disagreement with the application of standard number 1 and number 2. I might aid the board in providing some context to this particular petition. In quick summary, my client, Phoenix 4-H, purchased this property in 2005. As it is shown on the site plan is as it was purchased. They have not made any modifications or alterations to the property that resulted in this situation. It was purchased with the understanding that there was a conditional use permit for the parking on the 2 lots, 3 middle and west. That turned out not to be the case. We then entered into a discussion with the city as to how to resolve that particular issue. The way that we hope to resolve this issue is one where we maintain maximum compliance with the code with the minimum amount of relief possible, and we think that this has been a good faith effort to do that. The questions posed by the board are good ones, and I can address them briefly. There are the first question related to why are we here, and really it is as a result of the history of this property. The second was a question relating to ADA compliance of the property, and it's my understanding that we have not made any kind of request for any kind of variance for ADA requirements, and so those requirements would remain unaffected by a decision of the board tonight. The question with regard to the buffer landscaping, it is my understanding that because the conditional use permitting process has been restarted, we are now subject to the existing requirements of Title 21, and that the west boundary of the subject property actually complies with this. It's the east boundary that does not. The east boundary on the site plan you can see is the boundary between the subject property and another property which is zoned R4 but is also being used as commercial parking. The buffer that exists is on the subject property. There is no buffer on the other adjoining property. However, the depth or the width of the buffer landscaping is not quite to the current code requirements. In this regard, the petitioner has proposed that in exchange for the reduction in the depth of the landscaping, that we increase the density of the landscaping, working with a landscape planner and an arborist, so as to increase the density of the planting and increase or maintain the effectiveness of the buffer as a screen, so that the intent of the code is met without extending the screen further into the traffic lane. As far as the, there was a question raised about the fences and the location. That site plan is somewhat congested, and if I could clarify, there are some photos that we exhibited that show the two fences. The northernmost fence is the 4-foot conforming fence along West 27th. The fence south of that is the 6-foot chain link, so it's a non-site obscuring fence, which is non-conforming, and it is installed immediately adjacent to the guardrail. The guardrail was installed along with these fences by the previous owner, apparently in discussion with the city as to a condition of the stalled conditional use permit that vehicle access be restricted from West 27th Avenue. So these fences and the guardrail, which was intended to prevent vehicle access, are all located on that northern boundary. And the first of which, the most northern of which, is conforming. The second of which, and it's difficult to see, fences are denoted on the site plan by little blue X's, and they are, the second is virtually on top of the guardrail, which is denoted by the red line and squares. Makes it difficult to read, but that's the configuration. There are some photos that are exhibited to the application that might also clarify that. With regard to the variance request for the parking spaces, here there are 2 parking stalls on lot 16 that are 3 feet. There's an encroachment of 3 feet by the existing landscaping. It shortens those stalls to 17 feet. And it has the effect of shifting the traffic lane momentarily to a width of 23 feet. Now, the simple solution would be to simply remove that landscaping because it is not required on lot 16. And we could just take it out. However, it's the petitioner's preference to leave the landscaping in place. The reason being is that it forms a continuous screening buffer between the 2 properties, which is actually more consistent with the intent of the code, which requires the screening between the residentially zoned properties. So lot 16 is zone B3. These 2 parking stalls in issue are on lot 16. There is no landscaping requirement there. We could remove the landscaping. The parking stalls would then go to 20 feet, and there would be no requirement for a variance. We prefer that the landscaping remain in place. We think it enhances the aesthetic of the property. It provides a continuous screen, and it's simply the preference of the petitioner. In order to do that, we need the variance, which is why we're before you tonight. We have no objection with regard to the conditions placed on that particular variance. Traffic has conditioned that the 2 stalls, which are shortened in length, be marked staff only. We have no objection to that condition. With regard to the number of parking spaces, there are only 16 parking spaces on lot 16, which is the B3 lot. And there are 22 spaces required, which is why the additional 2 lots are being used as parking. We would prefer not to remove those parking stalls from lot 16. If the variance isn't granted, we'll comply with the traffic lane requirement by simply removing the landscaping, and it would moot that question out. In addition to addressing those questions, I have just a few other comments. First, that since the staff has agreed to remove condition number 4, we'll save that for the conditional use permitting process. At this point, then the petitioner has no objection to any of the conditions placed on these variances, and that we emphasize that while previous actions of previous owners become the problem of the new owner. Here we emphasize that the new owner was led to believe that this was a conforming and legal use, and that upon knowledge that it is not, we have worked diligently with the city to resolve these issues. And these variances are a component of that proposed resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deemer. Are there questions of the applicant by the board? Mr. Burkhart.
Yeah, the standard that I'm having the most problems with here is number 7, is the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. And if there's, I could understand if all the parking spaces were required by code, but you have, you know, almost, depending on which way you figure it, you know, about 18 extra parking spaces. And in relation to the 6-foot fence, you could pull that back and reinstall that farther away from that north property line, maybe without eliminating any parking spaces at all. The reduction of the buffer landscaping along the east lot line, you have 42 feet between your parking spaces, and all you're required to have there is 24 feet. And so simply going out there, saw cutting the edge of the asphalt such that you can put your 10-foot buffer in there, extending the striping a little bit, you know, another 2 feet into the lot, is something that would bring you into compliance without any variance at all. And the last item is where the 2 staff-only parking spaces. You know, you've got like 80% more required parking than you're required to have by code. And so I guess the question I put to you is that Standard 7 is written very, I guess, narrowly in terms of that the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. And I think you have conforming alternatives in front of you, and I think maybe what was overlooked here is that, yeah, exactly how many parking spaces do you need? So I guess I'm of the mind right now that I don't see that you meet Standard 7 in any of these cases.
Through the chairman, these are good questions, and the rationale behind the petition for the variances is with respect to the parking is to maintain as much parking as possible. The needs of the business are such that 22 parking spaces really isn't enough, that the additional parking is necessary. In addition, we would prefer to maintain the landscaping by way of exchange of shortening the parking spaces. At that point, we think that the aesthetic of the property is enhanced, and really the intent of the requirement of screening, as it's required on the northern 2 lots, is then extended to the southern lot 16. It makes a continuous screen between the adjacent commercial building all the way to West 27th. We think it just is more reasonable to maintain that screening, that there is no justification for removing the existing landscaping if the parking stalls can be shortened safely by 3 feet. Reasonable minds might disagree with that. With regard to the 6-foot fence, one of the concerns there has been, again, disturbing the existing screening, which is not required, but it is there along the northern property line of West 27th. Removing the fence and reinstalling it would disrupt all of that landscaping, which could be replaced, but it's existing. The fences are pre-existing along with the guardrail. The concern about the eastern boundary landscaping, you're right, there's 42 some odd feet in there, but it is used by the refuse company for their truck to turn around, and that's been our prime concern there, is that the dumpster location is in the back of the building, so it's not visible, and that space is used by the refuse truck to come in, service, turn around, and exit. And when the cars are parked in the existing parking stalls, all of that space is required, according to the refuse service provider, to maneuver the truck and provide service. Hence the request.
I guess I'm not following your logic that any of the landscaping has to be disturbed at all. To take down a chain link fence, it's got a wire fabric that's over it, would take two people just walking in among the landscaping to cut the ties to take that fabric off, and you could cut the verticals off at the right at the ground there. That there would be no destruction of the landscaping required to satisfy either variance request number 1 or number 2.
Well, through the chair, variance request number 2, I believe, is the eastern boundary of the lot for the landscaping buffer. And again, the extension of it will have the effect of shifting all of the parking stalls to the west.
Right, but not
and
the
narrowing
landscaping at all. I thought you indicated that reconfiguring that would cause landscaping to be removed.
No, sir. What it will do is it will extend the landscaping into the parking stalls, shift them to the west, and narrow the center traffic lane.
By less than 2 feet.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Are there other questions of the applicant by the board? Ms. Croft.
I'm going to follow up on the fence question. On the petition says that you wanted the 6-foot fence for security reasons. Again, back to the survey, does the fence extend all the way to the property line on both sides? It looks like it's only on one side.
Through the chair, yes, ma'am, it does.
It extends to on both sides. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Williams.
Yes, thank you. I'm just looking for some clarification as to what type of structures are to the east of the building so that the additional landscaping into Lot 16 is necessary, and where that lines up in relation to the landscaping and to the clinic building.
Through the chair, on the site plan, if you look at the eastern boundary, the clouded area is the landscaping, and it extends onto Lot 16 all the way to the corner of the adjacent commercial building. So it provides a continuous screen from West 27th all the way down that lot line to the existing commercial building on the adjacent property.
Okay, so it's a commercial building to the east then?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Boy, the comments are showing up on my screen and disappearing. Mr. Vig.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if maybe this is a question that staff might need to help me out with, but would replatting or re-subdividing these tracts into a single lot that had access off of West Northern Lights eliminate the front yard issue with this chain link fence that we're talking about right now, as being an encroachment in the front yard setback on West 27th?
Mr. Chairman, if I could respond to that. The preference is that there is not access from West 27th to the commercial business. That's, as my understanding, the staff have an opportunity to respond. It's my understanding that that's their preference as well. Replatting was considered and decided that this would not be necessary to address those concerns. We have a substantial security concern with regard to the activity on West 27th. In fact, APD generated crime density maps at our request, and they are enclosed as an exhibit, and it shows that this particular area is in a high to very high crime area with the number of occurrences on West 27th. So it's the petitioner's preference that there not be vehicle access from West 27th and that we maintain the fences either in their existing location or variance isn't granted and a new one.
But it is true that a replat that prohibited access off of 27th would eliminate the need to have this variance. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure that
If there's no front yard on West 27th.
Through the chair, if I can address that, if a replat was to be done and these 3 lots were basically one lot, it would still be what you call a through lot, which would in turn make for 2 front yards requiring full depth on both Northern Lights and West 27th.
Okay, thank you. So there's no platting solution here.
No, and we certainly wouldn't recommend replatting this. It would create a split zone lot, and planning doesn't typically support that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Croft.
Thank you. I'd missed a question before. On the building on Lot 16, can you tell me what is the use? I believe there are several uses in that building, and if you could explain why that would generate as much parking as, why do you need so much parking?
through the chair, the building on Lot 16 is a naturopathic health clinic. That's its only use.
That's the only thing that's in there, huh?
That's correct, and it's just due to the volume of providers and the number of patients attending that clinic that requires this parking.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Fink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Diemer, I'm trying to figure out this fence on the north side of the 2 northern lots, and I'm aware that that's a high crime area. I actually grew up in that area. It's a big drug street, I understand. What's the distance between the 4-foot chain link fence and the 6-foot chain link fence behind it?
Well, if I could have a moment, we might be able to look at an exhibit. Through the chair, I'd direct your attention to our Exhibit B, which is a photo showing the relationship between the 4-foot fence, the guardrail, and the 6-foot fence. I don't have the exact figure of the distance between those two.
A guesstimate?
But I would guess that it is probably 6 feet or less.
Has there been an experience where people from West 27th are jumping that 4-foot fence and you're finding them between the 6-foot fence and the 4-foot fence?
Well, there is a portion of the of interruption of the 6-foot fence. The 4-foot fence runs the length. The 6-foot fence does not run quite, I believe, to the eastern boundary line. And yes, there is evidence of not only people climbing over it, but actually, disassembling the fence so they can pass through it and under it to travel from West 27th to Northern Lights. We see a lot of discarded liquor bottles and other types of waste that is indicative of that type of transient through there.
But if the 6-foot fence doesn't go all the way to the eastern border, you're not stopping them anyway.
Well, it's the hope that we could make those repairs and that it would continue. It's damaged at the moment.
And would that be a repair, or would you actually be adding on to the fence on the eastern side?
It's my understanding that that would be a repair.
Okay. And I'm sensitive to the problem on West 27th, so I'm curious what that experience has been in it. Given that the 6-foot fence didn't go all the way to the eastern border, I wasn't sure that it was would be all that helpful in addressing your problems. With regard to the parking, is the parking lot generally full? I mean, has there been a parking issue for this clinic?
It is generally full. Between the employees, I'm also general counsel for the company that owns and operates the clinic. And given the number of employees and patients, it is generally full. which is one of the sensitivities that we have to the removal of those 2 parking spaces on Lot 16. Our preference would be to either obtain the variance or just remove the landscaping to retain those parking stalls.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions of the applicant by the board? Are there any at all? Does staff have any questions of the applicant?
No, we don't. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Deemer will open the hearing up for public testimony. Step aside, have a seat for probably a quick sec. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? Seeing no one, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any rebuttal?
Through the chair, no, we don't.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Deemer, do you, does the applicant have any rebuttal? No, we don't. He's indicated that he has no rebuttal. With that, the matter rests with the board. Could I have a positive motion from the board member with regard to this case, please? Mr. Vig.
Mr. Chairman, in case number 2010-131, I move that we grant a variance from AMC 21.45.110.A to allow an existing 6-foot fence in the front yard. Second, and from 21.45.125.C.2 to allow a reduction in buffer landscaping width along the east lot line of Sunbeam Subdivision Block 3, Lot 3, middle 50 feet. And third, from 21.45.080 to reduce the minimum parking stall length of 2 spaces from 20 feet to 17 feet, and to reduce the minimum 2-way drive aisle from 24 feet to 23 feet, subject to conditions 1 through 3 on pages 10 and 11 of the staff packet.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Burkhart, you've indicated you would second that motion?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig, would you speak to your motion, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Standard 1. I believe that there could be some exceptional and extraordinary physical circumstances, that being fronting on 2 significant streets, which has resulted in a known crime area that causes some security concerns for the applicant. I'm interested in other board members' opinions on that, but I believe that standard could be partially met at least, and that this configuration necessitates at least the 6-foot fence variance. Also, the need for maneuvering of service vehicles in the north side of the parking lot would make it impractical to reduce the aisle width there and provide a full width buffer of landscaping on the east side. So I believe that could be partially met. Standard 2, strict application of this code would create exceptional or undue hardship upon the property owner. And I believe that standard is met. Strict application of that code could potentially create a security concern, and I've experienced some of that in my business area as well, and I know what that can mean for employees and clients. So I think that's a real concern. Standard number 3, that the standard is not self-imposed. If the applicant relied on information provided by others that conditional use was in place and was not necessary, I can understand why this standard is partially met. The staff feels that. I believe that it's at least partially met and probably met. Standard number 4, I agree with staff that the variances, if granted, will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. Standard 5, the variance, if granted in keeping with the intent of the code, will not change the character of the zoning district. I agree with staff that that is substantially met. Standard 6, I don't believe that this granting this variance would affect adversely the health, safety, or welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage, so I believe that that's substantially met. Standard number 7, I think Mr. Burkhart raised some good points, and I would like to hear some more discussion about whether or not there could be some changes, but I think the reason being with the service vehicle accessing the dumpster on the north side of the building, that the buffer landscaping may not be able to be made much wider if the building truly generates the kind of parking demand that the petitioners talked about. Eliminating 2 parking spaces could be a problem, and if we can go along with recommendations by staff that those be limited to employee parking, I think that that's a pretty reasonable minimum variance request. So I'm prepared to find that standard is, as staff did, at least partially met, maybe substantially met. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Burkhart.
I don't think that standard 3 is met or 7 is met, so I don't plan on supporting the variance request. I think as far as standard 3, I think that the condition and circumstances are merely inconvenience. I think there are conforming alternatives here that would actually allow them to have at least as many parking spaces as they have now. And so with standard 7, I don't think that this is the minimum variance that grants a reasonable use of the land, because I think there is a reasonable use of the land in terms of the building and the parking. I guess I would note on page 2 of the packet, the site plan, in terms of the 6-foot fence in the front yard, that the location at which a 6-foot fence would be conforming would be 10 foot back from that north property line. And that's where you see the dashed line for the underground electrical easement. So a fence could be reconstructed there in a conforming location in an area that is landscaped right now without decreasing the parking area at all. You see the area that has the proposed snow disposal site. I believe they can put 4 head-in parking spaces in that area. I think they can actually capture a new parking space in the southwest corner of the west 50-foot lot down by the wood power pole. So I think they can gain at least 5 parking spaces that they don't have right now. And I think in bringing the buffer landscaping into a conformance at 10 feet at the east property line, they might lose a couple of spaces at the east property line where the lot that faces Northern Lights meets the residentially zoned lots. So it's not that they can't meet the minimum required parking, but I think they can actually have a conforming alternative needing no variance that does not decrease their parking by a single space. So I don't plan on supporting the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this case, I am disinclined to adopt the petitioner's argument that plating and zoning warrant acceptance that standards 1 and 2 could at least be partially met. I'm in agreement with staff that based on a lack of physical circumstances that those two standards are not met. I think Board Member Burkhart for his stating of fact that there appears to be some reasonably employed remedy in this case, which isn't something we always see. For those reasons, I intend to not support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Are there any other questions or any other comments from board members? I also find I do not believe I'll be supporting the motion, concurring with staff that standards 1 and 2 are not met, and also concurring with Mr. Burkhart on standard 7. So for those reasons, I do not intend to support the motion. Mr. Burkhart.
I guess one last item in terms of that dumpster location. There's no reason that the dumpster couldn't be relocated to on the other side of the fence on 27th Street and have direct vehicle access from a truck from West 27th. You could have a lockable gate where you could take trash out through there and put it into the dumpster. So even as far as the access to that for trash collection, I think could be improved if they reconfigured things. So I think that's also another reason why I think the space between the parking spaces on the north portion of the lot could be decreased by 2 feet.
Mr. Fink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm torn on this, and I don't know what standard this fits under. I don't know that it does, but fit under a particular standard directly, but I think it's fair for board members to bring their life experiences to the table. I grew up in that area. I actually delivered papers there for years. It's known as Crack Alley, a lot of prostitutes there. You move that fence back, and that's going to be a place where people do drugs, and people sleep, and people booze. So I'm sympathetic to the business owners about moving that fence back. So I guess I bring that to bear. I'm torn on this, and I can understand why they want to keep that fence there, and I think it'll be an absolute eyesore if you move that fence back. Again, I can't plug that into a particular standard, but I think it's worth bearing in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Ms. Williams.
I'm wondering if we could split this up into 3 different variance requests.
Would you like to make that motion, Ms. Williams?
Yes.
Ms. Williams has moved that we split the variance into 3 requests. Could I have a second, please? Or is there someone that would be willing to second that motion?
I'd second that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Ms. Williams, would you speak to your motion as far as splitting the 3? Just do you feel you'd like us to vote on each one separately?
Yes, that we vote on each one separately. I think that that they do bring up very different issues, and if we can separate them out, I think we could have a different result for the petitioner, and at least addressing some of their concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Fink.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the comments. I think that they do raise separate issues, so it'd be worthwhile to vote on them separately.
Very well. We have a motion to separate the variance into 3 requests. We need to vote on that. Could we please vote on the motion? That motion passed by a vote of 6-2. Now I get it. I'm treading on unclear waters right now, and maybe I'm mixing metaphors as well, but let's see, we've got Mr. Burkhart's motion. I'm trying to figure out how we want to handle this now. Do we have the first variance? Okay. So we'll just vote on each one. Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. Before we vote, are there any other, so we will be voting on each of the three variances separately. Are there additional comments that any of the board members would like to make? Ms. Williams, have you, I still have you in the queue. Maybe I didn't take you out. Okay. Yes, Ms. Croft.
I was just wondering, are you going to have discussion of each of the three separately? Is that what you were
That's what we were just
talking
discussing.
about?
And yes, so we now have before us the first variance, which is the 6-foot fence in the front yard. Would you care to discuss that, Ms. Croft?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. I think that when Mr. Fink was saying he didn't know where to put the fence issue, I think that the neighborhood that we're in does qualify under standard number 1 and 2, that it is an unusual circumstance of this particular area that would warrant a different condition than other properties. So I just think that would that's a place to put that particular notion is in finding that standards 1 and 2 are met for this particular this one of the three variances for that. And then that would also sort of spill over into standard number 7, that because of the kind of activity that you're concerned about there, and because of the problem there, that might be the minimum variance that we have to actually try and mitigate some of the actions that occur in that neighborhood.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Mr. Burkhart.
I don't think standard 3 or 7 are met. That what's happening here is that they've got a 4-foot chain link fence right on the property line, and they've got a 6-foot high fence 6 feet behind that. And so the conforming location is to put the additional 6-foot high fence another 4 feet back where they need no variance at all. They can still retain the 4-foot fence that's right on the street that basically makes this a no man's land for anybody to get into that. They have to climb at least over a 4-foot fence, if not a 6-foot fence. So I see them having all the security they need. It's just the location of the fence right now is in the front yard setback, and there's a conforming location for that 4 feet back. So I still don't see that standard 3 or 7 is met. I think it's a question of convenience. And it's not the minimum that makes a reasonable use of the land, since there is a conforming location, and the 4-foot fence that's allowed on the property line keeps people from getting into that landscaped area in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm in agreement with Mr. Burkhart's comments in that an additional 4 feet isn't necessarily likely to decrease safety. In fact, it may provide the petitioner an opportunity to build a fence that is indeed fully safe and expands east to west along that lot line.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Are there any other comments from any board members? Ms. Denny.
I'm in agreement with Mr. Fink, and having an additional 4 feet for people to congregate, leave garbage, I think would be detrimental to that property and to that property owner. I think having, if anything, they can shorten up the space, but since they already have the 6-foot fence there, I would say to leave it.
Thank you, Ms. Denny. Mr. Fink?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would concur with both Ms. Denny's comments and Ms. Croft's. You know, also in the back of my mind, I guess, is the intent of the law and the intent of the front yard setback, which is not met here by requiring they put that 6-foot fence 4 more feet back. I mean, this isn't, you don't have homes, so this is a parking lot in a high-crime area. And I guess I just don't see that we're meeting the intent of the code by requiring that.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Are there any other comments from any board members? Seeing none, please vote on variance number 1. That motion passes by a vote of 6-2. The next variance is to allow a reduction in buffer landscaping width along the east lot line of Sunbeam subdivision, block 3, lot 3, middle 50 feet. Is there any further comment from board members on this variance request? Any other comments for any of the board members? If not, please vote. No, it needs a 5. It needs 5. So it fails. Does that one show up? 5 votes are needed for a motion to pass, which is a majority of the fully constituted board. Fully constituted board consists of 9 members. So that motion failed with 4 yes and 4 no votes. The last variance is from 2145-080 to reduce the minimum parking stall length of 2 spaces from 20 to 17 feet and reduce the minimum 2-way drive aisle from 24 to 23 feet. Are there any further comments from any board members? If not, please vote. That motion fails by a vote of 7-1. So I believe variance number 1 passed. Variances 2 and 3 failed. I need to read for the record. Every final decision of the board shall clearly state on its face it is a final decision with respect to all issues involved in the case, and that all parties have 30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision to file an appeal to the Superior Court. That was our only case this evening. So that moving on to reports, the chairman. I guess a couple questions. One, do we have any cases for next month?
No, Mr. Chairman. December's a holiday.
Okay, so January is our next board meeting. We're at we're at a board of 8 right now. Is there another board member in the works? It's a 2-part question. That's 1. And 2, how much longer do we get to keep Mr. Burkhart and Ms. Croft on the board or strapped to their chair?
Ankle bracelets, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I believe this would be Ms. Croft's last meeting, and Mr. Burkhart, if I recall, had said he would stay through and including the January meeting. And Mr. Burkhart did nominate an architect with his firm and she has submitted a resume to the mayor's office, so we're hoping to hear very soon.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Very well.
Obviously, Ms. Croft doesn't realize that she's supposed to find somebody to fill her shoes.
Well, based on how well everyone's done on getting us to 9, I don't think that's an easy task. Well, Ms. Croft, it's been a pleasure working with you. If you don't want to show up in January, I guess we won't guilt you into it anymore. But it's been a pleasure. Secretary, the ordinance amending AMC chapters pertaining to land use boards and commissions. Is there any discussion by any of the staff on this item?
Mr. Chair, my name is Erica McConnell. I'm a planner with the Municipal Planning Department. I've been working on the Title 21 rewrite project for 8 years now, and I'm available to answer any questions about this ordinance. It's brought to you as an informational item. There is no code requirement for a public hearing since it's a change to Title IV. But we're bringing it to all the boards and commissions for your information, since it does affect the processes and procedures of each board.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Are there any questions of staff?
I guess my question is how would this change what we do currently?
The idea is that it doesn't. So it shouldn't change what you do.
Are there any other board member comments? Ms. Williams.
I would only note, and maybe this is the case, that for under Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals, it says that regular meetings will be held on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month. So that does add an additional meeting from at least what I've been used to. And also it looks to be a little change as far as the order, that staff would actually do their main presentation after the petitioner. So I would only note that.
I believe it's always said second and fourth. We've just lucked out. It used to be we'd have 2 a month. So, yeah. So we've gone to 1 a month.
And I think one time in this last year here that we didn't have a quorum for a meeting the second Thursday or for the first half of the month, so we had the meeting in the second half. So I think that just is kind of like it doesn't mean that if this passes that we're going to be meeting every 2 weeks. It just gives more flexibility in case a meeting has to be rescheduled.
And I guess this month is just odd because we had Veterans Day on the 2nd, and then next Thursday is the Thanksgiving. So, why are we meeting on the 3rd Thursday? That's not right. The heck? Hey. Huh. Are there any other comments? If not, we're adjourned. I think we did a good job of keeping the time to an appropriate level. It seems like one way or another we're going to take